Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 149. Judaism? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And before we start our interview today, we'd like to start our episode in an unusual way for our interview episodes, but one that we have done the last few weeks because it's the end of the tax year, the end of the calendar year, and also Hanukkah has just recently passed and you might have a little bit of extra gelt in your pocket. We're hoping that you might consider an end-of-year donation to Judaism Unbound. We often suggest something like $1 for every episode that you listen to, so if you listen every week, maybe $50. If you listen occasionally, $18. And if you just really want to support our work and want to help with our bigger project, perhaps you might consider a larger gift. Whatever you're able to give, we appreciate it. It's what helps us all keep going. And it's very easy to do. Just go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate. And also, if you haven't done our listener survey yet, we would love it if you would go to www.judaismunbound.com/survey. As we've said before, it's not your typical kind of survey. It's asking you about what are your unmet Jewish and Jewish adjacent needs where we might be able to help in some way in the future through podcasts or other kind of projects that we might do. So we appreciate your gelt, your gift, and we also appreciate the gift of your advice and your wisdom. So thanks so much in advance for that. And now let's turn to our guest today. He is Daniel Boyarin, the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Professor of Talmudic Culture in the Departments of Near Eastern Studies and Rhetoric at the University of California at Berkeley. Daniel Boyarin is a towering figure in the academic study of Talmud and of Jewish studies. He is the author of numerous books, many of which have incredibly good titles, including Carnal Israel, Reading Sex in Talmudic Culture, Unheroic Conduct, The Rise of Heterosexuality and the Invention of the Jewish Man, Borderlines, The Partition of Judeo-Christianity, The Jewish Gospels, The Story of the Jewish Christ, A Traveling Homeland, The Babylonian Talmud as Diaspora, and his most recent book, which is the jumping-off point for today's conversation, Judaism, The Genealogy of a Modern Notion, which is part of a series on keywords in Jewish studies published by Rutgers University Press. Daniel Boyarin, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's a great thrill and honor to have you on.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. Well, Lex and I have been fans for many years, and so we're interested in asking you about so much, but we wanted to start with your most recent book at the beginning, which is part of a series on keywords in Jewish studies, and you've taken on the keyword, perhaps, in Jewish studies of Judaism. And I think we might need to change the name of this podcast after this interview because your main idea in that book is that we should be using that word less and more carefully. And we would love it if you could help our listeners understand a little bit what you're saying about the word Judaism.
Great. First of all, don't misunderstand. There is Judaism now. If you're doing a podcast on Judaism and speaking to a contemporary audience, I would think even an audience that might be listening to this podcast 6 months from now or something, should it survive that long, the term Judaism has resonance. I don't think it can be defined, but that's true of many of our most important terms that we can't quite define them. So I'm not arguing for us to abandon the term Judaism in our common speech. First thing I'm trying to show is that it is not a historical term, that it is a modern term. The first piece of the argument is to show that there is no native term that corresponds to our word Judaism and its cognates in other European languages, including Israeli Hebrew, which is to a great extent the European language as well. There is still some controversy about I imagine there's a lot of controversy, but I'm aware of some controversy. Some of my very good and honored friends and colleagues reject my argument about ancient Greek Judaismos, that there are very, very good reasons not to read Judaismos, which only shows up in a very few ancient Jewish texts, basically 1 and 2 Maccabees, the letters of Paul, and that's it for pre-Christian usages. When Josephus, who never uses the word Judaismus, by the way, he does use the verb from which it's derived. And he says that certain women in Syria, Judaizantes, they were acting like Jews. Now, many of the English translations of Josephus will translate that as they converted to Judaism. There is absolutely no warrant for that. This kind of verb, which appears over 1,000 times in ancient Greek, means acting like a. So medizontes would mean Greeks acting like Persians. Judaizantes means non-Jews acting like Jews. The next step is likely to be, I know it is much more controversial, and that is the argument that without a word or a set of words, I am not committed to being one word, but without a linguistic designation for a particular concept or category, it is A, unwarranted to ascribe that concept or category to the people, to the group of people about whom we are speaking, and very likely a distortion of their way of seeing the world. What interests me is to find out as much as possible how they saw the world, whether it's my Zeta in Vilna or Rabbi Akiva. There are scholars who are absolutely committed to using our modern categories, including ones that they avow are modern categories. So, for instance, the late lamented Jonathan Z. Smith granted that religion is a modern category. In fact, he calls it an invention of the scholar's study, but argues for its utility for comparative purposes and for engaging in an operation that he calls reducing the unknown to the known. My enterprise has been to increase the amount of unknown, to raise what seems to be known to the unknown, to question all the categories, never to assume them. And the third aspect, then, this is only the third aspect, is what are the consequences? And in fact, with respect to this last book, the Judaism book, which ends up being a fairly sustained argument by implication that there never was a religion called Judaism until it was invented in Germany sometime in the 18th century and gathered steam in the 19th century. Hence the book is called Judaism, the Genealogy of a Modern Notion. The implication is nonetheless that if I'm arguing that Judaism, and I don't want to use that term, let's say Jewry, the corporate body of the Jews, is not a religion, then it must be a nation. And if it's a nation, then we're at Zionism. Right? That's what I've been getting from people. So how can I argue that Jewry does not constitute a religion on the one hand and be a confirmed anti-Zionist on the other? That's what I'm going to answer in the next book.
I look forward to reading that. That unlocks a lot of really important topics. But first off, I wanted to name that my family was in Vilna, so maybe our families were friends. Who knows? But so that's number one. Number two is you talked about Paul, and you talked about Paul not, and you used the word pre-Christian, and for some listeners that might be confusing or new. And so I wanted to name that. And I also wanted to tie it into a lot of work you've done over the decades on questions of Judaism and Christianity, Judaism in quotes, Christianity, however we think about those things. I wanted to bring up this question of where Christianity plays into this, because in this most recent book, in Judaism, you present the argument that to the point that Judaism does now in 2018 and in recent years exist as a construction, it's in large part due to Christian definitions of it over time. I love the way that what you're calling us to do, as you said, is just rethink how we apply contemporary categories like Christianity, like Judaism, to ancient times. So just where does the interaction of Jews and Christians play into this, both historically and maybe as the centuries went by?
Good. First of all, let's talk about Paul, because that's getting that sort of out there, as you say, or named, and to a certain extent clarified, will enable other parts of the conversation. I refer to Paul as pre-Christian. He certainly, and this is generally agreed by most Pauline scholars, Christian and Jewish, Paul seems never to have had a consciousness of himself as having left either the Jewish folk, Kihila, the congregation of Jews, or certainly of having entered into or founded a new religion. In fact, I would argue that probably the very terms of that sort of a statement weren't available to him. He certainly provides a powerful internal critique of some aspects of the way that Jews practiced, or the way that certain groups of Jews practiced. But that doesn't mean in any sense that he had stepped outside of Jewry or had some conception of himself as outside of Jewry. This is a distinctly un-Christian reading of Paul. So that brings us to the next stage. How can a reading of Paul be unchristian? Well, first of all, I'm arguing that this is an unchristian reading of Paul in two ways. It's not the way Christians would have wanted to read Paul, at least until very recently. And secondly, it doesn't read Paul as Christian. It reads Paul as Jew, with a passion for a path to salvation for the non-Jews as well. And so that's not Christianity. Christianity comes into being through a double process. One, the rejection of historical Israel as being in any way promised or having been given a path to salvation that is valid. What's called supersession in the extreme sense. Not only we can do it too, and we don't need the Torah, but your observance of the Torah is worthless. You have been rejected. So that is one of the producing factors of Christianity. And the other is the fascinating insistence that Christianity is of all nations. Once Christianity comes into being in that sense, which gets crystallized in the late 4th century, early 5th century, then some version of the notion of a religion or religion comes into being. I'm not arguing against the idea that religion is essentially an early modern concept, but I'm saying that there is some precursor form that is constituted by Christian orthodoxy. And I don't mean by that Greek or Russian orthodoxy. I mean historical Christian orthodoxy, the church, which comes into being again around the 4th, 5th century. And then, since there can't only be one thing in the world, there always has to be its dark double. In order for something to be plus, there has to be something else that's minus. There has to be a paradigm within which two things can fit. We find Christian writers, beginning with Ignatius of Antioch, very beginning of the 2nd century, and then kind of snowballing, contrasting Judaismus and Christianismus. So in their eyes, that is in Christian eyes, in Christian writers' eyes, Judaism is something that is a member of the same category of things as Christianity, but obviously the wrong one. Jews never bought into that. There is no abstraction ever that, and certainly no sense of a religion that is disembedded, abstractable from the whole fabric of Jewish life. In the 19th century, the notion of the religion being separate from the rest of life became very attractive. Certain kinds of Jews, certain kinds of Jewish leaders, certain kinds of Jewish communities, including Orthodox ones, I'm not talking here about Reform, wanted to be able to be full citizens and full members of the polities in which they lived. And one begins to get the idea of a man in the street, but a Jew at home. strikes me that many, many, many Jews, being asked to define Judaism, would say it's my religion or it's a religion. Actually don't mean that at all. That's a convenient way of speaking, that's translatable, it's understandable. But it seems that there is so much more to it. The possibility of Freud declaring that he is a Jew all the way down, and that's who he is and what he is, even though he does not keep any mitzvahs, does not believe in God, considers religion to be an illusion. That's intelligible. Mm-hmm. We may not all agree with it, particularly certain, religious Jews may say, well, he's missing the main point, but still the statement is intelligible. It's much harder to imagine somebody, I'm a Lutheran all the way down, right? That's what I am. That's who I am. But I don't believe in God. I don't believe in Jesus. I don't take the Eucharist, right? That's not an intelligible statement. Let's take a simpler example. My parents were Christians, but I'm not. Does not mean the same thing as my parents were Jews, but I'm not. My parents were Jews, but I'm not is a radical statement of disidentification. You can't be a lapsed Jew. If you want to stop being a Jew, you have to do something. You have to stand up on a mountain and say, like Gilad Atzmon, I am not a Jew anymore. I'm no longer a Jew. Or an act such as conversion to another. And even then, just think of Cardinal Lustiger, who said of himself, I was born a Jew, I die a Jew, I was a Catholic by faith. To say I was born a Catholic and I died a Catholic, but I was a Jew by faith, is not a parallel statement. So there's something wrong, fundamentally wrong, with the idea of there being something called Judaism, which is an abstraction and which is the name for the collectivity of the Jews, and it's a religion. And I think we instinctively feel that. But the way things have been set up, that the choices are nation or religion, and with the understanding that nation then implies nationalism, which implies state sovereignty and self-determination, has left us with a what seems to be an intractable dilemma, which lived itself out when I started making this argument against Judaism as a religion and getting responses from friends. Are you a Zionist? Have you become a Zionist? Some of them saying, "Oh, have you repented?" And others saying, "Have you reneged?" Right? And, it came in two versions.
Can we? I think we'll sort of ultimately connect all the threads, but I also think for our listeners it would be very interesting to go all the way back, or not all the way, but part of the way back in history again, and talk about that period that we talked about a little bit earlier from the pre-Christian perspective. And I'd also love to talk about it a little from what perhaps we might call the pre-Jewish perspective, that transition from the Second Temple period through the early sort of ancient period to what ultimately became that thing that you described and that in modern times turned into Judaism. But could you've been teaching for many, many years, and I would just love to hear from you some of the things that we've learned about the history of that period that you tend to hear from your students, that it's completely blown their mind, completely something different from what they had imagined.
There is an important, I'm going to answer that somewhat obliquely, but there is a way in which the notion of Judaism as a constant, as a given, which grows and develops and has history, etc., provides people with almost an emotional way of articulating for themselves what Jewish collective and historical existence it is, right? So it gives people a kind of a figure of thought that enables them to connect with Judah Maccabee, for instance, with Moses, with Rabbi Akiva, with with the Crusades and the disasters for Jews. Right? This is Judaism, so it's an inheritance, and I don't even want to take that away. I'm not Oscar the Grouch, nor Sam the Eagle, but I want to imagine for myself and for some other people who may be inclined, and this may sound elitist, but I'd be happy to welcome everyone into this elite, to substitute for that name and that concept the books, the words. What constitutes for me Jewish collectivity is the texts that I share with the people who wrote them, the communities of Jews that produce them, whether it's the Talmud, whether it's medieval piyut, whether it's Sheilot Teshuvot, responsa, literature about halacha. And it is that shared inheritance. Maybe 10 years ago, I would have said patrimony. And it is to a certain extent that, but we're resisting that notion that it belongs, even when it historically has been largely kept for men. So I am part of that collectivity. But also at the same time, I know that I'm sitting here in California. Somebody is sitting in Vilna. Somebody is sitting in Tunis still. Many people are sitting in the Holy Land and studying the same book, maybe the same page, right? So this community of shared text, shared learning, and shared practice. What moves me about Netilat Yadayim, washing of hands before eating, is not some idea about purity. It's not irrelevant, but that's not. It's the fact that my Zeta did that before he ate, and my Baba, and that goes back generation after generation after generation. That's where I see collectivity growing, and not in the name, in an abstract name, which, by the way, is given agency. Then we're told Judaism says this, Judaism says that, Judaism believes, Judaism doesn't believe. Half the time the statements are nonsensical, right? What they mean is some Jews don't believe or don't believe. Judaism doesn't believe in heaven and hell. If I had $1 for every time I've heard that statement and I had invested it well, I could have retired 10 years ago from everything. Not that I would have wanted to. Judaism doesn't believe in heaven and hell. Plenty of Jews do. and most Jewish texts imply. So Judaism doesn't believe in heaven and hell means I don't believe in heaven and hell, right? Or my rabbi, one of my heroes is Bertha Pappenheim. But she had one of those very, very Yeckish characteristics of assuming that whatever German Jews do is the norm. And so she describes in her diaries having to explain to East European Rebbes, Hasidic Rebbes, that Judaism has no dogma. Again, and this doesn't take away from my admiration of her, but I just think it's exemplary of what happens when you set up an abstraction like that and start defining it and saying what it is, what it isn't. You end up with those kinds of absurdities.
I really appreciate that, and I wanna really hammer that point home in a few ways, and I want to do it by maybe returning to something that came up right towards the beginning. I mean, we were talking about, and you said, Judaism does exist today, and so I'm in many senses with you. But I also want to complicate what exist means, because I think you mean it different than how some people might. Because when some people say Judaism exists, they mean like a transhistorical thread of X with an essence that is maybe not entirely unchanging, but sort of consistent throughout many centuries and eras. And I know that's not what you mean. But so I wanted to bring that up because I think there's a risk. I think there's a consequence that could happen to folks reading your book that I want to avoid, because I think somebody could read your book, and if they're a rabbi or if they're a Jewish communal participant in one form or another, they could say, this is great and feels really true in the scholarly world, but like, oh, that's the scholarly world. And in my Jewish world or in my synagogue or from the Bima, we don't really need to internalize this because it's a different can of worms. And there is something, on some level, there's something to that, right? Like I get why the spiritual work that happens in Jewish spaces is going to be different sometimes and often from what happens in a classroom or in research or in books and journals. But also, like, we should really learn from this. We should really say it matters that Judaism doesn't believe things. That, as you just said, that Judaism doesn't have agency, and that should absolutely affect how rabbis or others speak about Judaism and about Jewish stuff. And we should really be aware of how the consequences of speaking about Judaism can really marginalize in the ways you just laid out. Like, it's not just Bertha Pappenheim. Like, when we do this, when we talk about Judaism and we imply that, you know, X, Y, or Z is sort of the most Judaism thing, and then, oh, sure, there's also others dissenting on the sidelines or others that might look different or others, like, it's easy to see how talking that way can have really problematic consequences and hurt people. So I want to, like, this is a long-winded way of asking sort of, so what? Like, how does this matter for contemporary Jewish spaces? And you could speak a little to how this matters for Jewish studies, but I'm really mostly interested in the extent to which this really does matter for Jewish spaces that aren't purely academic in nature as well.
Your first question, the first part of your question is very shrewd. When I say Judaism exists, I do not mean in the Platonic sense, you know, that there is a form, a sphere, an idea of Judaism that an abstraction that is transhistorical, that maybe changes in its expression. That's exactly not what I mean. When I say Judaism exists, I'm speaking in the terms of the philosopher Wittgenstein, who said explicitly, and I talk about this in the book, that saying red, R-E-D, exists means only that within a given language, with the language we're talking about, the word red is meaningful. So saying red does not exist, first of all, always has to be specified within a particular form of life, a particular community, a particular culture, a particular language, would only mean that the word red or an equivalent to it, I mean, I'm not talking necessarily about R-E-D, it could be also Rioja or Adom, that there is no word in that language that attaches itself to the set of usages within which we in English use the word red. So to say that Judaism exists now means it has meaning for Jews as for Christians. Saying that Judaism did not exist in the 1600s for Jews means that there was no word in Jewish language that meant anything like what we mean when we say Judaism in our parlance, with all the variations and nuances of that. So manifestly today, Judaism exists because in our language we have it. If I say Judaism, people more or less understand what I'm talking about. We might have slightly different ideas of that, etc. So that's one point. So it's not a statement of an existent in the Platonic sense at all. Secondly, I think we can seek to purify our language, at least those of us who are thinking carefully, including pulpit rabbis and Jewish communal leaders, from making statements along the lines of Judaism believes, Judaism dictates. That's, I suspect, and I could be totally wrong, that you were thinking about in part about the way that Judaism believes, tends to exclude Jews who don't.
Absolutely.
But it comes from the other direction also. When I hear some leftist friends saying, "Oh, Jared Kushner's not a Jew," or Sheldon Adelson, he's not a Jew. Real Jews support socialism. People who vote Republican aren't Jews. There are various. And I'm deliberately taking examples from what's closer to my end of the spectrum. I'm not going to read anybody out of Judaism by saying Judaism demands social justice either. I may say, and I would say, I can support Jewish endeavors or my endeavors for social justice as well by enlivening it with materials from traditional Jewish sources. But I can understand others then turning around and saying, well, that's the devil quoting scripture. So in that sense, any kind of essentialization in the name of an agent, Judaism, which does or does not do something, which does or does not believe something, I think is something that we could work to purge from our language and would have salutary effects. And it's part of the insistence that Judaism is not a religion. Right? A religion is something that you can kick people out of. Right? You can declare that they're heretics, whether it's Sheldon Adelson you want to kick out or Daniel Boyarin. I don't want to use family metaphors because they raise all kinds of other problems, right? But let's, focus, not in the German sense, in the Yiddish sense, or Klal Yisrael, the collective. You can't throw people out because you don't like them. You can't throw people out because they're bad. We have met the enemy, and they are us. And that sense of collectivity, which is something like a family in certain aspects, let's not overdo it. The Jews is not a family, but there are certain aspects, the same way I can say, I hate my Uncle George, who's in jail now for a grand larceny, but I can't say he's not my Uncle George. And the rabbis caught that in the Talmud. Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisrael. An Israelite, by which they mean what we mean a Jew, but they didn't use the word Jew in that sense. An Israelite, even though he or she sins, and now I'm adding in brackets, even grievously, is still Yisrael. Developing that sense of Klal Yisrael and untying it from territorial sovereignty. Not such a new idea. I mean, it's the way Jews lived for more than 1,000 years, right? With some good results and some awful results. But on the other hand, state sovereignty hasn't been so successful in producing only good results either.
I want to ask about something that is sort of, I think, behind a lot of what you're talking about, which is, and perhaps I'm fundamentally asking a question about contemporary, what you said earlier about sort of the contemporary implications of what we're talking about. And whether or not there should be any, I think for a lot of Jews, they are looking to history and to our stories to try to figure out sort of what comes next, as you are too, in talking about this next book that you're going to work on. And I'm curious about how you, as somebody who's worked in both realms, think about the importance of the texts and the stories we tell and the truth, right? The history. Because I think people are looking to both. So if they don't like something in the text, for example, or they don't like something in sort of the story as it's unfolding right now, they may reach back and say, but it doesn't have to be that way, because in history, actually, it's not how the Talmud describes it. It actually was a very different way. You've written about the myth of Yavna. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the difference and whether it makes a difference in terms of the stories, for example, that we've told about Yavne, this transition point from the Second Temple period to Rabbinic Judaism, and the truth of what may have actually been happening, both of which you've written about.
Well, or even the truth of what the stories that were being told up to 100 years ago. I mean, Yavne, right on the face of it, says, you can have Jerusalem, just give me Yavne and its sages. In other words, already locating the locus of collectivity and collective value in study and in text. So, I agree with you. I mean, a tradition is ever changing. It changes in part through reading a text. Always involves two parties, a reader and the text, and it's the interactions that produce ever-changing senses and adaptation, and the reference to the same set of texts also. But it has to be good reference, learned reference, not just the Talmud says or the Midrash says, the type stuff either. And it's not only Talmud and Midrash, although I think Talmud is the arch text, but then my friend from inside says, well, you would say that you're a professor of Talmud. I think that it's the exact opposite. I'm a professor of Talmud because I feel that way. But anyway, I think the last sentence, I think, of Carnal Israel is about tradition. And tradition as being sort of this repository that we work with to produce a usable past and a livable present.
Thank you for opening up a lot of these conversations. We both really appreciate it. Before we go, I'd love to dive a little bit into just you, Daniel Boyarin, the person. We've spoken a lot about your book, and if you could give us a little bit of a lens into just sort of what makes you, what is it about your upbringing or your life or your quest that has brought you to this place where you're writing a book about questioning the notions of Judaism that we take for granted? And just tell us about you.
This is one of the stories I could tell. I grew up in an odd place. I grew up in rural New Jersey in a community of Jewish chicken farmers. We had an institution called the Jewish Community Center, which was nothing like the Jewish Community Center in South Orange or Newton or Brookline or anything like that. It was a small building in which everything Jewish took place. There were quite a number of Jews. There had been quite a number before the war. My grandfather came out there. His three sons, that is my father, my two uncles, came out there and built chicken farms. My grandfather's brother-in-law founded the Jewish Community Center, and it was a community in which all kinds of Jews got together. We didn't have an Orthodox synagogue, conservative synagogue, a temple. We had the services. There were services there on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Shabbos morning at any rate, were highly traditional, loosened up some to enable more people to feel comfortable. One evening, there could be davening, and the next evening, a socialist meeting. I think I developed my sense of Klal Yisrael, of Knesset Yisrael, of the Klal Yisrael, the wholeness of the Jews, in a sense, the corporate identity of Jews, not wholeness in the sense of completeness, and of Knesset Yisrael, of the community, largely through the experience of that tight, very, very frequently fractious, but also somehow ironic community of Jews that I first knew. On Kol Nidre, every year there would be a fight about whether we say certain piyutim or we don't say certain piyutim. But I noticed that sometimes the fighters reversed positions from one year to the next. But that there was a fight about that. But on the other hand, when my father happened to be president of the community, my father, very, very, I don't want to say secularized, because I don't, but a freie Yid, was not an observant Jew, became president of the community, and I was about 4 or 5 at the time, and it was at the time of the doctors' trials in Soviet Russia. Half of the leftists in the community wanted to break with the communists because of anti-Semitism, and as we know, another large group of Jewish leftists remained, at least for another few years. I mean, this happened in Israel. You all know, presumably, that there are many kibbutzim where there are 2, Ein Chorod Aleph and Ein Chorod Bet, 2 different kibbutzim with the same name, because there had been one, and they split over exactly this issue, also in the early 50s. So I can remember the shouts from the shul. We lived a block away. I can remember shouting well into the night so that the whole complex of a Yiddishkeit somehow that got imprinted on my soul, as well as the sound of Yiddish being spoken and Hebrew being prayed. Yeah, so that's the foundational moment. All the rest is biography.
Echoes of the rest is commentary right there. I like that. Thank you so much, Daniel Boyarin, for joining us. This has been a fantastic episode.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it thoroughly.
And thanks, of course, also to all of you out there listening. We greatly appreciate you tuning into this episode, and we hope that you'll join us again in the future. We want to close out this episode, as we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to Twitter at Judaism Unbound. That's our handle. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can head to our email addresses. Send us something. Send us questions. Send us thoughts. Send us ideas, whatever, at Dan@JudaismUnbound.com and/or Lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we'd like to make is that we really deeply appreciate any amount of monetary donation you are able to set aside for us, and you can do that at JudaismUnbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.